very interesting. Questions, comments?
People can speak up because I turned 52 a few weeks ago and I seem to have gone a bit deaf.
You only hear the things around you.
Exactly, selective deafness.
Yes.
Yes, I'm just interested if the British government sent these radicals out as convicts, were they not worried that these convicts might get together and have a revolution here?
The government wasn't at first, because Australia was like the other side of the moon, the one you don't see. You know, it was so far away and there's not many people here, so it's simply out of the world. But the governors were greatly worried. When 500 United Irish rebels arrived, the governor said, what an importation. But then he concentrated them out in the western suburbs at Castle Hill on large government farms. It was before there were enough MacArthurs and others and the assignment system hadn't really developed. So they're all together. So yes, I mean, that they were worried, and there were a number of inquiries into the transportation system. And one of the political prisoners, a fellow called Margaret, who was a bit of a double agent, a bit of a Machiavellian figure, but he was sent to the coal mines of Newcastle for his role in perhaps fomenting that the Castle Hill business. He ends up giving evidence to one of the inquiries about transportation, and that leads to reform. There are successive reforms throughout the early parts of the 19th century, and what they do is scatter people. But then there's another reform in Van Diemen's Land where they put them on, they want it to be equal. They think giving people to farmers, to private farmers, smacks of slavery. So the kind of same people that are involved in the abolition of the slave trade and the freeing of the slaves in the British Empire end assignment in Van Diemen's Land, and they're then put in chain gangs. And that actually leads to a decline in the treatment of the convicts, because they actually got a better deal for the most part working for someone on a farm. It's a lottery, of course, but being on a chain gang, there aren't many of us that would survive very well in that, particularly the political prisoners who tended not to be hard and tough people in the same way. When the swing rioters arrived in Sydney in 1831-32, that's 500 agricultural workers for the most part. It was it was like the best auction ever, because most convicts came from urban ghettos and weren't very farm-wise, and the colonies needed people with farming skills. So, you know, that was quite a bonanza. What's interesting is I've read some of the letters of the convicts, and one young boy writes back to his mother. He says, "Mum, I've learned to write, and I'm eating beef and eating sugar and getting honey. You should come out here." So for poor working people, they're actually having an improvement in calories and things by being here. And, you know, once gold is discovered, in the East, you can't really send people here. It's not much of a punishment. But at first, it's just they excising political radicals from Ireland and Britain from causing trouble. Britain fears, people like Burke fear a revolution in Britain following the French Revolution, and it happens in Ireland, and they fear it will happen in Scotland. And if you watch the film Amazing Grace, you get a sense of the mounting paranoia. And we've lived through it recently with the War on Terror and they bring in all these laws that make saying certain things seditious. So they're new laws. And by the time of the 1848 revolution in Ireland, it is not illegal anymore to say things. So they have to, it's not a felony, it's a misdemeanor. So they have to bring in a new law called the Treason Felony Act to allow them to transport people. And John Mitchell actually says, they brought in a law just to shut me up. And he says, He's going on about the potato famine, and he says, I will write these articles, I won't stop, come and get me. He dare, so it's a political strategy sometimes, as we know, to be elected and expose a bad law. And those laws can stay on the statute books for a long time in Ireland.
Thank you.
Others?
Just a comment from teaching the new national curriculum in Year 9. Well, prior to that in Victoria, we certainly often covered control model martyrs, for example. And in the new curriculum, Australian history is situated within a whole broader context of making modern world, you probably know. And so all those ideas about all of the Chartism and the socialism, all the new ideas, are tied into the whole overarching story that you give them set up to the students so they have a context. The problem, I guess, as a teacher, is just that it's such a vast sort of area that it's very difficult to cover in depth. I mean, we do depth studies, but even so, it's very difficult to both make those broader connections, which is so important, but also to cover things, not just to zone in so narrowly that the context is lost. So,
we did Chartism at school back in the day, isolated from Australia, and it's great that it's now connected in.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm suggesting that using one, it's the guys who wrote the Bible had it right. You have individuals, or the classics do it too. And I'm a theoretician on a good day, but I totally get you need people who are inspired by individual stories, and young people in particular. Hollywood knows it too. And so some of the individuals in my book, I'd like to think, because they're exciting stories, can actually get people in. And the ABC has commissioned a documentary of the book. So that will be there as, like the film Eureka Girls about the suffragettes and feminist movement. It just helps. I think having that audio-visual thing would be a concise way to do it. But I was surprised the Museum of Democracy at Eureka has William Smith O'Brien as an Irish leader there, but doesn't say he spent time here as a prisoner, and that's why he's remembered. We still are failing. We're putting things in national boxes, and Australia wasn't a nation then, and wasn't. If you lived then, people saw themselves as being part of an empire, not Australian as such. And so I'm trying to recreate that for young people that all at university want to do international studies. That's how they see themselves as citizens of the world again, partly because it's exciting, partly because of global information flows, and partly because of cheap travel. And I think that there's a way of getting them into the past with this.
Well, one of the things we do is we do look at significant people, so if we have that resource, that would be perfect.
Fantastic.
Tony, you mentioned that Thomas Muir escaped. I wonder, to what extent was that an organised thing, or was that an individual opportunity for him, or to what extent was it organised? Because you mentioned being part of the global...
Well, Australia's becomes not long after the first fleet arrived, the French arrived, but then the Yanks arrived, and there's seal fur trade, the beaver trade in North America and Canada, and whaling, and these are huge industries then. Whaling in particular for the lighting lamps and all sorts of things. So there is a lot of traffic through, and he negotiates with a fellow captain, because these are gentlemen, and you might imprison someone and banish them for 14 years, but you wouldn't let a gentleman in those, particularly the early period of convictism, be in, a group prison. So they're given land grants. As long as they desist from politics, they're given the run of the colony. So he's got the freedom to negotiate. What he does, he rows out in a boat. It's just him. His colleagues don't do this. Rows out past the Sydney Heads and gets picked up by the ship. It's quite exciting, isn't it? And Palmer, his colleague, who's a reverend and a Unitarian. A lot of these people have religious underpinnings. Presbyterianism, in part, fires Muir, and Unitarianism, which is sort of Anglicanism, becoming more secular and dismissing the Trinity, inspires a lot of radical people. And this guy Palmer brings the Encyclopedia Britannica out with him, and they're free. They believe in freedom in politics, but also free trade, and they encounter that great Australian tendency to monopoly very early on. The New South Wales Corps monopolises trade in rum and other things. So Palmer gets Encyclopedia Britannica and works out how to brew beer. And then he works out with his other mate, because he's brought one of his entrepreneur friends out, they work out how to build a boat, a schooner. Not a schooner to drink from, but a schooner boat. And start trading with Norfolk Island. And they use the law to say, you can't stop us trading. Then they start doing stuff with pigs, long before Paul Keating's piggery. And one of the New South Wales Corps shoot his pig, and there's a big fight about the pig. And, you know, the New South Wales Corps claim it's a Republican pig. That's why they shot it. But they don't like the competition. You know, it's a bit like Woolies and Coles. These oligopolies form in a small place. So they're championing free trade. So they stay to kind of fight the fight for economic development, and they write amazing accounts of the potential of the country, the plight of the Aborigines. You know, really good sources, you know, on par with what can teach. So it's kind of interesting. But, you know, I guess they're all disparate and egotistic people. So they're not really, while they're joined in their coming over as prisoners, they're not part of a movement. And even the young islanders, who are much more tightly bound, all go their different ways. Because they're, again, a lot of them escape. Not William Smith O'Brien, he's the captain of the ship. He decides to suffer. But Mitchell and Marr and a few others escape. But it's important they surrender their parole before they escape, because they're gentlemen. And in these days, to not be honourable, if you're a gentleman, you'll lose respect. So you have to go back to this other country that is the 19th century and understand the codes. And so they have a falling out over how honourable they are. And also William Smith O'Brien falls out with Marr because Marr marries a poor girl, a girl in poverty who's not his equal. So there's all these funny things about social class and etiquette that are going on. And it's different, and then there are religious differences. So, you know, it's a thick book, and all of those complexities are there. So I've just given you a very potted, simplified version. Hope that answers your question.
To what extent can you trace political implications in Australia? The philosophies that they brought actually did shape the way in which parliamentary institutions were established here, political processes and so on and so forth.
That's a very good question. Two answers to that. Firstly, the movements of which they are leaders, Young Ireland, Chartism, you know, Owen's trade union movement, are having influences here, not just through those individuals transported, but through the literature that's coming in, and free immigrants who are part of the same movement. So there are many, many, many Charters that immigrate when their movement fails in the UK, and they start cooperative building societies. They're involved in the reform movement, and really the demands at Eureka and the constitutions that are agreed to in Victoria and New South Wales are Chartist constitutions. And, you know, the union, you know, we have direct things with someone like William Cuffey or William Smith O'Brien writing a draft constitution, and, you know, someone like Duffy taking Young Ireland into this ultimately not completely successful Selection Acts. So I believe they're part of they're not the sole source of dissemination, but they are part of a general exchange. And certainly those movements are bolstered by their martyrdom and publicity. They're very good at attracting publicity. The commemorative plaques at Canada Bay and Battery Point to the Canadian rebels do say that these people brought responsible government to Canada and Australia and the Australian colonies, because Lord Durham, who writes the Durham Report, which creates a federation ultimately in Canada, sees that they can see that ultimately the British Empire of settlement doesn't want any more of these revolutions and these United States things happening, and they want to give autonomy and representation to the colonies, because they're always wanting to tax them for their own defence and services, but they don't want to give everyone the vote, but ultimately they have to. So what we might think of as this, what happened in Australia in the 1850s was first won by these Canadians. And maybe it was the dignity of their suffering in Australia that helped get it. Certainly the active revolution, while unsuccessful in Canada, really shocked the British. It's interesting though that when people in Australia start asking for it, the radical Republicans and others start asking for it, they say, what, a convict colony? But the Australians say, well, we want convictism to stop. And the anti-transportation movement becomes part of the next part of the move for reform here. And republicanism is really interesting here. We've got a funny idea today of what a republic is. People in the United Irishman movement or Muir or any of these people, for them a republic was popular sovereignty. It was not about head of state. So you could be a crowned republic. You could have a king, you could still be a republic. The Americans elect a king for every 4 years or whatever. You can do that. And a lot of people more or less thought mission accomplished, really. There's a great book by McKenna called The Captive Republic. So that many of the principles of republicanism are achieved. And the great compromise perhaps is federation under the crown and things go backwards. But there's quite a lot of radicalism in the 1850s and 60s about that. And that's the unfinished legacy, if you like. My argument, and I've provided connections to an article I've written, is that the republicanism in Australia going forward should not be about the head of state. That can be there. It should be about extending democracy, and perhaps in an American-style way where we vote, because colonies are governed from the centre. So Melbourne governs the hinterland, or Sydney governs. That's a colonial model, and we don't have that much election of boards or elections of local officials like some countries do. In fact, we think it's bad. Socialism's often said we need central control, and the more central the better. But maybe I'm interested in kind of Republican thought, and maybe we need to think about more autonomy and democracy at the local level. Certainly our local government is not enshrined in any constitution and lives a sleazy life in this country, and not a very efficient one. I think we have to really throw out that ARM argument about heads of state. I'm not saying don't do that, but it doesn't get anyone excited.
Other questions, comments?
Is there much of a link in your research with New Zealand in any shape or form?
Not really. In other work I do on Australian Bohemian culture, yes. Some of the biggest ratbags come from New Zealand, particularly journalists and political cartoonists and those sort of characters, but not really with this project. It wasn't a convict colony, so whilst there's a very healthy trans-Tasman world, and New Zealand is another colony like New South Wales and Victoria, and people, circulate amongst them, but the political prisoners are not detained there. New Zealand doesn't really have that.
we might be coming to that time of day. Any others? Last questions? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruby.